For years, Stephen and Nancy Moore longed for the sound of laughter in their home. And just when it felt like hope was slipping away, they welcomed Kevin. A bright, curious boy who quickly became the center of their world. But as life moved forward and careers demanded more of their time, the Moores made a decision they believed was right. They hired help. And in Winifred Nolan, they found someone who seemed to be everything they needed. Gentle, dependable, and deeply devoted to their son. She didn't just blend into the home. She became a part of it. But years later, long after trust had taken root, a quiet suspicion would begin to grow. A memory, a sketch, a test. And with it a truth neither of them could have imagined. This isn't just the story of a perfect arrangement gone wrong. It's the story of what happens when danger wears a smile and betrayal walks through the front door with a spare key. This is the story of Kevin Moore and the woman who called him her special boy. Welcome to the Crime Series. I am glad to have you join us on another video. Kindly subscribe, like, and share. Let me know where you are watching from. Kevin Moore was in 7th grade, a stage where childhood innocence lingers, but the first signs of adolescence begin to show. He attended a private school not far from his home in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Though he wasn't exactly the most popular kid in class, Kevin was well liked by his teachers and classmates for his inquisitive nature and gentle personality. He was the kind of boy who asked questions that made adults pause. Questions about how clouds worked, why people cried when they were happy, or what made someone a good person. He was deeply imaginative and loved reading mystery books, building Lego cities, and writing short stories in a notebook he kept hidden under his bed. Kevin didn't have a large circle of friends, but he had a couple of close ones. Dylan and Marcus, neighborhood boys who occasionally came over to play video games or ride bikes after school. Still, Kevin often preferred the comfort of home and familiar faces. That made his relationship with Winifred even more important. Though Kevin loved his parents dearly, he missed them often. On weekdays, they left early and came back late. He always looked forward to Saturdays. Family movie night was his favorite time of the week. He craved their attention and approval, and always tried to impress them with schoolwork or his homemade comic books. But it was Winifred Nolan who filled in the gaps during the week. To Kevin, Winifred was more than a nanny. She was a constant. She listened to his stories, laughed at his jokes, helped with his homework, and never acted too busy for him. She made him feel important. He trusted her completely. Sometimes when he fell asleep during story time and woke up tucked in with his favorite stuffed bear by his side, he would whisper that she was the best person in the world. To Kevin, she wasn't just a caregiver. She was his safe place. Until she wasn't. Nancy Moore was the kind of woman people often described as graceful under pressure. Quiet, observant, and deeply intuitive, she spent the early years of her adulthood pouring her heart into teaching elementary school. She had a gift for understanding children, their moods, their unspoken worries, their need for safety and affection. It was a role that fulfilled her, even as she quietly struggled with the one thing she wanted most, but couldn't seem to have. A child of her own. Nancy and Stephen Moore spent nearly a decade trying to conceive. After countless doctor visits, fertility treatments, and heartbreaking miscarriages, Nancy finally gave birth to Kevin, their only child. His arrival was not just a celebration, it was a healing moment. She often called him her answered prayer, a phrase she repeated during bedtime cuddles and morning routines. For the first 7 years of Kevin's life, Nancy dedicated herself fully to motherhood. She quit her job to stay home with him, spending every waking moment learning his habits, his sounds, his needs. But as Kevin grew older and her husband's career advanced, Nancy began feeling the itch to reclaim her professional identity. When a former colleague reached out with a consulting opportunity, she took it, telling herself it would just be part-time. But the job turned into more. Her competence made her indispensable, and soon she was traveling for presentations, working late nights, and managing high-stakes education reform projects. Though she loved the work, the guilt never left her. Every missed dinner, every half-heard story over the phone from Kevin chipped away at her peace of mind. Still, she comforted herself with the belief that Kevin was in good hands. That's why Winifred Nolan felt like such a blessing. The bond between Winifred and Kevin seemed genuine, even beautiful. Nancy often said that she didn't just trust Winifred, she was grateful for her. Stephen Moore was a man of logic, order, and precision. A mechanical engineer by training and a senior project director at a leading aerospace firm, Stephen had spent his entire adult life building things, systems, prototypes, and solutions. In his world, everything had a function, a fix, a path forward. But what he couldn't blueprint or troubleshoot was the one thing he and his wife longed for most, a child. Years of fertility struggles weighed heavily on his marriage, and though he rarely showed emotion outwardly, Nancy knew how deeply it hurt him to watch her grieve every failed cycle. Still, Stephen never broke. He became her rock, steady, reassuring, promising that one day it would happen. And when Kevin finally arrived, Stephen felt like the universe had finally paid him back for his patience. Before the DNA tests, before the questions, before everything shattered, there was just Kevin. For the first few years of his life, Kevin knew nothing but warmth. Nancy left her teaching job to care for him full-time. Stephen, though not as expressive, was attentive in his own way, installing safety gates, baby-proofing the house, and stacking college savings accounts before Kevin even spoke his first words. But time has a way of shifting priorities. By the time Kevin turned 7, Nancy was back in the workforce, this time as an educational consultant for a national reform agency. The job was demanding, often taking her across cities for conferences and policy work. Stephen's own role in aerospace development meant early mornings and late nights, sometimes entire weeks, buried in deadlines. What they couldn't give Kevin in time, they tried to give in comfort. Private school enrollment, a room filled with books and toys, and most importantly, someone to care for him after school. For the first 3 years of Nancy being back in the workforce, it was a rotation of nannies. Some too young, some too cold, some who just didn't seem to connect with him. Kevin was polite, always, but Nancy could see the disappointment in his eyes when each one left. Like he was getting used to goodbyes too early. Then came Winifred Nolan. She was different. Older, early 30s, with a calm presence and an easy smile. She spoke to Kevin like he was both a child and a person, patient, but never condescending. In a matter of weeks, the house felt warmer again. Kevin laughed more. He slept better. He mentioned things like Winifred's story time and Winifred's snack experiments as if they were events in a world only he was lucky enough to live in. Nancy was relieved. Stephen satisfied. Finally, someone they could trust. What they didn't know was that trust can be the most dangerous thing to give, especially when you're not around to see how it's used. Kevin was now 10, his world neatly orbiting around school, homework, a few neighborhood friends, and Winifred. She helped him with assignments, taught him songs, even tucked him in when his parents worked late. If Kevin ever had a second home, it wasn't outside his house. It was inside it, in the presence of the woman who had quietly become his constant. The Moores never questioned how close they had become. Not yet. Because at that point, everything still seemed perfect. But perfection, as they would learn, can be the first sign that something is very, very wrong. By the time Winifred Nolan had been with the Moores for 6 months, it was clear. She wasn't just another hire. She was the missing piece. It wasn't just how seamlessly she fit into the household, but the way she anticipated needs before anyone voiced them. She prepared Kevin's lunchboxes with handwritten notes tucked inside. She folded laundry before Nancy asked. She stocked the fridge with snacks Stephen liked after long shifts. She didn't ask for praise. She simply made herself irreplaceable. Kevin adored her. Not in the passive way a child tolerates a babysitter, but with genuine affection. He looked for her first thing after school, shared every detail of his day, and sometimes waited at the window for her before she arrived. They had inside jokes, invented handshakes, and a weekly tradition called Imagination Hour, where they built stories together, always just the two of them. Nancy watched it all with quiet gratitude. The guilt of working late, of not being there for every scraped knee or math test, softened knowing Kevin had someone who cared. Winifred was gentle, never overstepping, always deferring to Nancy and Stephen as the final authority. It was that deference that made her seem even more trustworthy. But beneath the surface, things were shifting. Kevin had started becoming more reserved around other adults. He still played with his neighborhood friends, Dylan and Marcus, but he often turned down invitations to go to their houses. He preferred to stay home. He said Winifred had new games she wanted to try with him, games that were just for the two of them. Nancy brushed it off. After all, Kevin was a homebody by nature, and Winifred's presence gave him stability. If anything, the closeness was endearing. But there were other, subtler signs. Like the time Nancy overheard Kevin excitedly trying to tell Stephen about one of the games. "It's called freeze time," Winifred says, before Winifred herself entered the room, laughing gently and finishing the sentence for him. "Silly game, really. Just storytelling with pauses." Stephen laughed. Nancy smiled. Kevin went quiet. Or the way Kevin stopped hugging his parents as much. Not out of defiance or distance, but because, when asked, he'd say things like, "Winifred says I'm getting too old for hugs now." Or, "She says I should save those for special people." At the time, it sounded like harmless advice, an adult helping a boy grow up. But it wasn't. It was conditioning. Winifred's control was never loud. It was a soft, invisible thread wrapping around Kevin's world, tightening gently, week by week. She was methodical, patient, and to everyone else, she was still the perfect fit. She never raised her voice, never broke rules, never crossed lines that could be seen. But in private, she was rewriting Kevin's sense of what was normal, what was appropriate, what was allowed. And no one noticed. Not yet. By 12, Kevin Moore had grown into a thoughtful, imaginative lad. Still gentle, still curious, but more private now. He kept things to himself, not because he was hiding, but because he'd been taught to believe some things were better left unsaid. Winifred Nolan had a way of making ordinary things feel magical. She didn't just help with homework, she turned it into riddles and quests. She didn't just cook dinner, she hosted chef competitions in the kitchen. To Kevin, she made the world feel more exciting. But also more secret. That's when the games began. Not board games, not video games. These were games Winifred made up. Freeze time, secret missions, trust training. They all had rules, but the rules were always changing. Sometimes they involved touching, other times hiding. Often they ended with Kevin being told, "This is just our game. Grown-ups don't understand. They'd ruin the fun." To Kevin, these were adventures. They came with laughter and reward. Sometimes candy. Sometimes praise. And always the reassurance. "You're my special boy. You're more mature than kids your age. You understand things others don't." And he believed her, because Winifred had become the most stable person in his life. His parents were still loving, still present on weekends, but weekday mornings were a blur of brief goodbyes and evenings passed in exhausted silence. They didn't see what he saw. They didn't live in the hours when the house was quiet and Winifred filled the silence. There were moments when Kevin tried to speak. Small windows of innocence, times when he almost said too much, not realizing what he was revealing. Once, he rushed into the living room where his parents were unwinding after a long day. He was excited, eager to share a new game he and Winifred had been playing. But before the words could form, Winifred appeared, calm and smiling, gently steering the moment away. She framed the game as something simple, something educational, a memory exercise. Nothing to be concerned about. Kevin beamed with pride. His parents, distracted and trusting, smiled and moved on. Kevin had no idea what was being taken from him. To him, it was just play, just attention. He didn't know the rules were being rewritten, not for his benefit, but for someone else's control. Winifred had trained him to keep secrets, disguising silence as maturity. She made him feel special for not asking questions. She gave him praise for being quiet and reassurance when he seemed unsure. Because when control is carefully disguised as affection, resistance rarely shows up at the door. And when trust is weaponized early, the victim never sees it coming. Because monsters don't always come in with threats or violence. Sometimes they come in with cookies and bedtime stories. Kevin had just turned 12 when Winifred Nolan announced she was pregnant. She made the revelation casually, seated at the kitchen counter, hands wrapped around a cup of peppermint tea. It was unexpected, but not alarming. In the 2 years she'd been with the Moore family, Winifred had never once mentioned being in a relationship. She was warm but private, always professional, never inviting curiosity about her personal life. So when she shared the news, Nancy Moore was surprised but not suspicious. Winifred explained that the baby's father was a longtime boyfriend, someone from her past, a relationship, she said, that had always been complicated. The pregnancy hadn't been planned, but she was happy, grateful, and at least on the surface, uncertain about how the Moores might react. Nancy, unaware of what lay beneath the surface, was supportive. She offered help, prenatal care tips, vitamins, even a small gift from a boutique downtown. When Winifred insisted she would continue working for as long as possible, Nancy encouraged her to take it easy, but Winifred declined. She said Kevin needed her. It came across as selfless, devoted, admirable. At the time, Nancy saw it as a sign of loyalty. Kevin was elated. The thought of a baby in the house was thrilling, especially one he could see, hold, and talk to every day. He peppered Winifred with questions about the baby's name, whether it would be a boy or girl, and if it would like dragons. She answered every question with warmth and enthusiasm, deepening the emotional bond between them. She even let him feel the baby kick. As the weeks passed, Kevin began referring to himself as a big brother, a title Winifred encouraged with subtle affection and carefully chosen words. To Nancy, it was sweet, harmless. She had no idea just how close to the truth her son's words really were. Not yet. Winifred eventually took a short maternity leave and gave birth to a baby boy, a healthy child with round cheeks and soft brown eyes. And when she returned to work weeks later, bringing the infant along, the dynamic in the Moore household quietly shifted. Kevin was enamored. He held the baby, rocked him, even made up songs to help him sleep. He started referring to the child as my baby brother. If you found this story compelling and appreciate the way we bring real-life cases to you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Your support helps us continue to uncover the truth and share these important stories. Like, share, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going. At first, Nancy and Stephen thought it was sweet, but for Nancy, something began to itch beneath the surface. The baby, Jasper, as Winifred named him, looked familiar. Too familiar. There was something in his eyes, in the shape of his chin, in the way his mouth curled when he cried. It reminded Nancy of Kevin as an infant. She shook the thought off at first. Genetics were strange. Babies resembled everyone and no one. But that feeling, that mother's intuition, started to grow louder. And soon, Nancy began to look at Winifred, not just as the woman who had saved their home, but as someone who might have taken something they never realized was being stolen. At first, Nancy Moore told herself she was overthinking it. She blamed the long hours, the travel, the guilt of missing too many school events. Maybe that's why Jasper's face stirred something in her. Maybe she was just projecting Kevin's baby pictures onto someone else's child. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It started with a photo. Kevin had printed it from the family computer, an old snapshot from his baby album for a school project. Nancy found it on the kitchen counter next to Jasper's pacifier and paused. The resemblance between the two boys was unnerving. It wasn't just the eyes. It was the shape of the jaw, the hairline, the dimple on the left cheek that only appeared when they smiled. She stared at the photo longer than she wanted to admit. Still, she said nothing. Then came a passing comment, one that on the surface seemed innocent. Kevin mentioned that Winifred had told him the baby would probably look more like him as he got older. Because, as he put it, we're connected. He said it proudly, casually, with the unfiltered joy of a child repeating something he didn't fully understand. But for Nancy Moore, the words hit differently. They stayed with her. That night, she brought it up to Stephen, quietly, without accusation. Just a thread of concern, something she couldn't shake. Stephen listened. He didn't dismiss her, But he didn't engage either. He simply offered a tired response, one that many spouses might give when fear still feels irrational. He told her she was probably overthinking it, but Nancy wasn't sure anymore. In her mind, pieces began to shift into place. The timing of Winifred's pregnancy, the way Kevin clung to her, the subtle erosion of boundaries, the way Winifred inserted herself into Kevin's emotional world, not just as a caregiver but as someone central, even possessive. The thought that crept in was unthinkable. It felt far-fetched, impossible. But it also made sense of things that, until then, had never quite added up. And once that kind of suspicion takes hold, it doesn't let go easily. Because sometimes the most horrifying truths begin not with what's seen, but with what's quietly felt. And so, without telling Stephen, without alerting Kevin, without raising a single suspicion, Nancy quietly took action. She waited until no one was home. Then, with the calm of a mother who had waited too long to trust a hunch, she collected 2 strands of hair from Kevin's pillow and a pacifier that had fallen near Jasper's crib. She placed them in a sealed plastic bag. And the next day, while the world went on as usual, she sent them to a private DNA lab, just to be sure. Just to quiet the voice that had started whispering in her mind. The voice that said, "What if the baby in your house is more yours than you know?" The envelope arrived on a Thursday. It was small, unmarked, quiet, just like the fear that had been growing inside Nancy Moore for weeks. The house was still. Kevin was at school, Stephen was at work, and Winifred had taken Jasper out for a walk. Nancy sat at the kitchen table alone. The same kitchen where Kevin had once played with finger paints, and Winifred had first shared her pregnancy news over a cup of tea. She opened the envelope slowly. Her hands shook, but her mind was calm in the way that only comes when you already know the truth. You're just waiting for confirmation. The report was short, clinical, direct. The lab results showed a 99.998% probability of a direct biological link between Kevin Moore and Jasper Nolan. Nancy stared at the paper in silence, her breath caught in her chest. She didn't scream, she didn't speak. Everything she had feared but hadn't dared to say out loud now stood in front of her, in ink on paper. Nancy folded the report slowly, methodically, and slid it back into the envelope. There would be time for emotions later, time for anger, for grief, for action. But now she needed a plan. Because Kevin didn't know what had been taken from him, and Winifred Nolan was still in their home. Nancy Moore didn't scream. She didn't storm into the nursery or throw the DNA report in Winifred's face. Rage wasn't her instinct, not yet. She moved through the house that evening like a ghost, her eyes tracing every object in her path, as though seeing it all for the first time. The toys on the floor, the drawing Kevin had taped to the fridge, one of him holding hands with "my baby brother." Even Jasper's tiny socks near the washer made her heart ache in ways she couldn't explain. Because none of this was just betrayal. It was something far worse, something calculated. Their son had been groomed under their roof, too young to understand what had happened to him, too trusting to see the danger behind a soft voice and a warm touch. That night, Kevin came home from school and hugged his mother as usual. She held him longer than normal. "Mom, you okay?" She nodded, her voice caught in her throat. "Yeah, baby, I'm okay." She wasn't. She had to make a choice. Call the police immediately, confront Winifred first, pull Kevin aside, and explain a truth he was nowhere near ready to hear. Nancy chose silence. For now. She needed time, a plan. Not just for justice, but for Kevin's protection. Because Winifred Nolan was still in the house, and Kevin still loved her, still saw her as a friend, still saw her as someone safe. That was the most devastating part. He didn't know he had been violated. He didn't know the games weren't games. And if Winifred sensed suspicion, if she felt the walls closing in, who knew what she was capable of? So Nancy watched and waited, and Winifred smiled. She rocked Jasper in the living room, humming softly, like she had nothing in the world to hide. But the glass had already cracked. And the next touch, the next word, the next breath, would be the one that shattered it completely. Nancy Moore had never been one to move in anger. She moved with intention. And after what she learned, that's exactly what she needed, intention, not impulse. Nancy made a decision. She would not confront Winifred with rage. She would observe. She would gather. She would make sure there were no more doubts, because what had been taken from her family deserved more than a confrontation. It deserved accountability. That weekend, Nancy told Stephen everything. This time, he didn't try to rationalize or brush it off. He was stunned, devastated. But now, with proof in front of him, he couldn't deny what had happened. "We need to get her out of the house," Stephen said. Nancy agreed, but not yet. If Winifred suspected anything, she might disappear. Take Jasper with her, or worse, convince Kevin to protect her. And so, Nancy and Stephen began documenting everything. They noted Winifred's routines. What Kevin said when she wasn't around. When she entered or left the home. They checked devices, search histories, photos, anything that might provide context for authorities when the time came. Nancy also scheduled a private counseling session for Kevin, framed as a growing-up check-in. The therapist was discreet and experienced in working with children. Nancy hoped, prayed that Kevin would feel safe enough to speak freely. He didn't. Not yet. But he did draw something. A crayon sketch of himself, Winifred, and the baby, all holding hands, all smiling. Above the drawing he wrote, "Our little secret family." Nancy kept the drawing. It was innocent, but it said more than words could. And while Winifred continued her days as usual, changing diapers, singing lullabies, baking muffins for Kevin's lunch, Nancy watched. She noticed how Winifred always positioned herself between Kevin and others, how she answered for him in conversations, how she used phrases like, "He's growing up so fast," and "We have a special understanding." Nancy kept her expression neutral. She smiled when she needed to, but beneath the surface, she was preparing for the moment that smile would disappear, because the clock was ticking, and Winifred Nolan's time was running out. Through cautious and professional therapy sessions, certain patterns began to emerge. Kevin spoke about games he and Winifred had played, names like freeze time and trust training. He remembered being told that these games were special, that they weren't for everyone to know about, that they were just between him and Winifred. He struggled to recall the exact details, often describing his memories as blurry or confusing. But what was clear to the trained ear was this. Kevin had been subjected to grooming, emotional manipulation disguised as affection, carefully designed to suppress discomfort and silence questions. He recounted feelings of wanting to please Winifred, of not wanting to let her down. He mentioned being praised for keeping secrets and being reassured that their connection was something unique, something others wouldn't understand. It was enough. The licensed child therapist, after gathering sufficient disclosures through multiple sessions, filed a formal report with Child Protective Services. Nancy and Stephen Moore were immediately briefed on next steps. Law enforcement would need to be involved. A forensic interview with Kevin would be scheduled, and a case number was officially opened. Though Kevin never used words like abuse, the emotional undertone of his recollections, combined with the forensic evidence and professional assessments, formed a disturbing but undeniable narrative. Winifred Nolan's influence had gone far beyond caretaking. She had cultivated silence, she had blurred boundaries, and she had embedded herself so deeply in the family's trust that even the truth took years to surface. Now, for the first time, that silence was beginning to fracture. By the time law enforcement became involved, the Moore household had already passed the point of no return. The DNA results, paired with Kevin's disclosures through therapy, painted a picture that could no longer be ignored. What had once appeared to be a story of deep familial trust had now unraveled into a potential case of child exploitation, one involving emotional grooming, abuse of authority, and the child who had unknowingly become a father. A formal investigation was launched into Winifred's background. Authorities found no prior complaints or red flags. She had passed all background checks and had glowing reviews from previous families, most of whom described her as professional, discreet, and deeply committed to the children she cared for. But none had remained in contact with her after her departure. She seemed to disappear from every family the moment the job ended. Investigators also began collecting potential digital evidence, searching devices, looking into messages, browsing history, and examining any possible data from the Moores' home network. Their focus was on identifying any communications, photographs, or documents that could either confirm or dispute Kevin's account. At this point, Winifred Nolan was still working in the Moore household, unaware that an investigation had begun. Nancy and Stephen were advised by both legal counsel and law enforcement to maintain normalcy, to avoid confrontation, and to ensure Kevin's safety at all times. Any sudden reaction could alert Winifred and complicate the investigation. But what no one could predict was how much Winifred already suspected. She had become more guarded, more observant. She started asking subtle questions about Nancy's schedule, about Kevin's mood, even about items in the house that had moved slightly from their original place. She sensed a shift in the energy around her. And for the first time, the woman who had controlled the narrative for years began to feel it slipping through her fingers. The investigation was now officially active. What began as an unspoken suspicion had turned into a criminal case. And the woman who had once been trusted like family was now the subject of a search for the truth. One that would determine not only her fate, but how deeply the damage had been done. As the investigation quietly gained momentum, the atmosphere inside the Moore household became colder, tighter. For weeks, Winifred Nolan had operated with subtle confidence, her routines seamless, her presence quiet but commanding. But lately, that confidence had shifted into something else. She was watching more carefully. She hovered during conversations. She lingered longer in doorways, listening before entering a room. To the outside observer, she remained composed. But behind her carefully measured smiles, Winifred was beginning to unravel. Unknown to her, Child Protective Services had already filed a report with the district attorney's office. A team of investigators had reviewed Kevin's forensic interview, the DNA results, and notes from the therapist. A search warrant was being prepared, one that would allow authorities to access Winifred's phone, her devices, and her private quarters within the home. But Winifred could feel something was coming. One afternoon, Nancy returned home earlier than expected. Winifred was in the living room with Jasper, but Kevin was nowhere in sight. When Nancy asked casually where he was, Winifred hesitated, just for a moment, but it was enough. "He's upstairs, I think. Maybe in the guest room," she said. Nancy's instincts ignited. She went directly to the guest room and found the door slightly ajar. Kevin was alone, sitting on the edge of the bed, looking pale and distant. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said enough. Something had happened. Something that left him unsure, unanchored. Something that confirmed Nancy's growing suspicion that Kevin was no longer safe in his own home. Nancy reported the incident to law enforcement that same evening. It was the final confirmation that Kevin's safety was now at immediate risk. The next morning, the Moore family was relocated to a nearby relative's home. Winifred was told they were leaving town for an emergency. She was paid through the end of the week. No questions. No drama. And while she nodded in understanding, her eyes lingered on Kevin just a little too long. She knew. She didn't know the details. She didn't know how much they'd discovered, but she knew the walls were closing in. 3 days after the Moore family quietly relocated, Winifred Nolan was served with a warrant. The arrest came quietly. No handcuffs in public, no sirens, no spectacle. Investigators approached her at a nearby grocery store parking lot. She complied without resistance. To onlookers, it may have seemed like a misunderstanding. A woman asked a few questions. Another one showed paperwork. Winifred calmly stepped aside, placed her hands behind her back, and was escorted into the back of an unmarked vehicle. But for the investigators, it marked the end of a carefully built case that had taken months to piece together. The charges were grave. She was arrested on multiple counts related to child exploitation and unlawful conduct with the child. The supporting evidence included sworn testimony from Kevin, documentation from child therapy sessions, DNA confirmation of biological connection to Jasper, and evidence gathered from her personal devices, which had been quietly seized in a sealed warrant. Though there were no photos or videos recovered, no physical evidence that could be used to prove acts beyond doubt, what authorities found was still damning. internet searches, private journals, and deleted messages that painted a disturbing picture of intent, manipulation, and obsession. During initial interrogation, Winifred remained calm. She denied all allegations. She insisted the DNA test was manipulated, that Kevin was confused, and that the family had turned on her without reason. But the timeline, the testimonies, and the behavioral patterns told another story. And that story didn't align with innocence. The arrest stunned the community. Those who had known Winifred only through work or casual acquaintance were shocked. Many described her as gentle, soft-spoken, always polite. No one ever suspected what she was capable of. But predators rarely wear the face of a stranger in the dark. More often, they wear the smile of someone you trusted, someone you let in. And now, the woman who once held a child's hand under the banner of care was facing the full weight of the law. For Nancy and Stephen Moore, the arrest marked the beginning of a new chapter, not one of relief, but of reckoning. Because while justice had begun its course, the damage left behind would take far longer to repair. The arrest of Winifred Nolan sent a ripple through the Moore family. But what followed was less like a storm, and more like a slow, relentless unraveling. Kevin, now aware that something serious had happened, continued therapy under closer supervision. His understanding of events was still fragmented, shaped by what his mind could handle at young. But he knew that Winifred was gone. He knew that something about their relationship hadn't been okay. Therapists and trauma counselors explained that recovery would take time, perhaps years. Kevin would need patience, structure, and emotional stability. His view of trust had been permanently altered. And even though his parents had done everything they could to protect him, there was no undoing what had already been done. Nancy, who once prided herself on her intuition and attentiveness, carried a quiet burden of guilt. She replayed moments in her mind endlessly, times Kevin had tried to speak, and she hadn't listened closely enough. Meanwhile, Jasper, the child at the center of it all, was placed under temporary protective custody while the legal system determined his future. His biological connection to Kevin presented unprecedented challenges. Was he a brother? A son? What role, if any, would the Moore family play in his life moving forward? That question remained unresolved. In the eyes of the law, the case against Winifred was proceeding. But for the Moores, justice was only one part of the story. Because while the court could issue a sentence, it couldn't restore what Kevin had lost. And as the headlines faded, the family was left with the quiet work of rebuilding a life that would never again be the same. The trial of Winifred Nolan began just under a year after her arrest. The courtroom proceedings were closed to the public due to the involvement of the child. But even behind closed doors, the weight of the case was undeniable. The charges were serious. Multiple counts relating to the exploitation and manipulation of the child, custodial interference, and contributing to the unlawful endangerment of a child. And while the legal language was clinical, the meaning behind it was clear. Winifred Nolan had used her position of trust to cross unthinkable boundaries. The prosecution's case leaned heavily on the DNA evidence linking Kevin Moore to Jasper Nolan, now legally recognized as his biological child. That alone formed the backbone of the timeline. But prosecutors also presented transcripts from therapy sessions, Kevin's forensic interview, expert witness testimony on grooming behavior, and documentation of Winifred's carefully orchestrated control over the boy's emotional and psychological space. Each piece fit together, not to create a spectacle, but to build a cold, methodical portrait of betrayal. Winifred's defense team claimed the relationship had been misunderstood. They leaned into the absence of explicit physical evidence. They suggested that the DNA could have been mishandled, that Kevin's memories were unreliable, that the Moore family had turned on Winifred out of fear, guilt, or revenge. But the timeline was airtight. The emotional manipulation had left traces. In Kevin's drawings, his statements, and his deep confusion about loyalty, secrecy, and affection were impossible to ignore. He did not testify in person. Instead, the court relied on his recorded interviews, supported by psychologists and child welfare specialists who explained the toll of abuse, especially when it's wrapped in routine, praise, and silence. The courtroom wasn't loud. There were no outbursts, no dramatic declarations, just quiet tension. The kind that comes when truth is finally spoken after years of being carefully hidden. When closing arguments ended, the jury deliberated for only a few hours. Winifred Nolan was found guilty on all major counts. She was sentenced to 24 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after 18. She showed no emotion as the sentence was read. After extensive evaluation and a lengthy custody process, the court granted guardianship of Jasper to Stephen and Nancy Moore. He would remain in the only home he'd ever known, not just because of biology, but because of stability, love, and safety. It was Nancy's decision to tell Kevin the truth herself. Not all at once, not with every detail, but enough. Enough for Kevin to understand that Jasper was not just his little brother, as he had once believed, but his son. A child born from circumstances no child should ever be exposed to, but one who still deserved care, connection, and belonging. At first, Kevin withdrew. The weight of that truth was crushing. The confusion, the shame, the guilt, none of it was his to carry, but he carried it anyway. Therapy became a lifeline, and time a quiet companion. Slowly, Kevin began to rebuild. He didn't call Jasper son. He wasn't ready for that. But he chose to help, with bedtime stories, with feedings, with tiny moments of affection that spoke louder than words. To him, Jasper was a responsibility he never asked for. If this story moved you, disturbed you, or opened your eyes, subscribe to our channel for more real-life crime documentaries and fictional stories inspired by true events. We uncover the darkest corners of human nature, so you can be more aware, more informed, and maybe even safer. Until next time, stay sharp, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something just isn't right.
He's just, but he's already a father, and who the mother is will shock you. She used to be his nanny. What is your earliest memory of Marissa, your nanny, crossing the line?
It was a game called Are You Nervous? And the object of that game was she'd place her hand somewhere on my body and I'd say if I was nervous or not. And things escalated from there.
The live-in nanny, Marissa Mowry, was 22 years old. Chris McBride was just an 11-year-old kid, as you can see in this home video.
She said that she loved me. She said that she wanted to date, but she couldn't let anyone know.
Did Marissa make you lie about this?
Yeah, plenty of times. She said, you have to lie or else I'm gonna have to go away.